video, I'm going to explain how method arguments work for the Ruby programming language. If you are new to Ruby or you're working on a code base that you haven't worked on before, it can get a little confusing seeing all of the symbols in the Ruby method definitions and invocations. Many people who might be used to a simpler programming language see all these colons and splats. A splat is another word for a star or an asterisk, and are probably left wondering, what do all of these things mean? Part of what is confusing is that Ruby started its life only having positional arguments. Then in Ruby 2, keyword arguments were introduced. On top of that, we have this special thing called rest arguments. That's where you use the splat. And then on top of that, we have keyword rest arguments also. So this video will be a little bit long because I'm going to walk you through and show you all of the rules. And it turns out that because all of these different options between positional and rest and keyword arguments, there are actually 14 different examples. So I'll go through each example one by one to explain every part of how the arguments work in Ruby. Just a couple things before we get started. One, in this video, I'll use many arbitrary examples. These examples are the kinds of things you might find in a real production app, but for the most part, all of the argument names are just for demonstration. In many cases, in a real production app, it wouldn't make sense to do all or some of the things that you see here. So just remember that this is just for demonstration purposes and for learning. Two, all of the examples use a method name that has a very unimaginative name, and the name is my method. Just keep that in mind, that every example uses the exact same method name. And of course, I'll switch up the arguments as I move between examples. The third thing to keep in mind is that although I'm a huge proponent and teacher of test-driven development, in this learning exercise, I'm not going to take the time to write out tests for all these examples because we aren't writing any production code. If you are new to my course material, or if you are a recent bootcamp or CS grad, I recommend you read my short blog post called The Pyramid of Learning to Code, in which I discuss the 3 levels of achieving excellence in software development. 1, the language fundamentals, 2, the theory of system design, and 3, testing. The video you're watching today is squarely in the language fundamentals category, so keep in mind that the purpose here is just to provide you with foundational knowledge about the workings of Ruby, but you still should pay attention to theory and testing. Finally, there's an accompanying blog post that you can follow along, and I recommend that you do that. This video might have a few more tidbits than the blog post has, but for the most part, the video follows the blog post pretty much exactly example by example. So the video and the blog post go together hand in hand. And with that short introduction, let's dive into Ruby arguments. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to make a straight up plain Ruby file. Open my IDE here, which is RubyMine. And to do this, we're just going to say new file, arguments test RB. So the customary thing to do so that we can execute this file, although it's not necessary in this case, but I'm just going to do it anyway for demonstration, is to put the bash marker at the top. And let's do puts hello world. So I don't have permission, so I can set the permission like that. And then we should be able to run arguments test directly. And it says hello world. And that's possible because we put the bash marker up here. Of course, I can just run Ruby arguments test and get the same thing. So now that we just have the basic file, we know what we're doing, and we're ready to go. Ruby has 2 basic types of arguments. Positional arguments, which are specified by arity, that is, by the positioning of the variable in the method definition, and keyword arguments, which are specified by the name of the argument. Most programmers are familiar with the basic concept of arity-based parameters. The first variable passed to the method becomes the first variable within the code of the executing method. These are called arity-based parameters. Keyword arguments, introduced in Ruby 2.0, allow you to write code that doesn't depend on the positioning of the arguments, because every argument is explicitly named. I will refer to positional arguments as arity arguments, but for the formal name is positional arguments. Whatever it's called, it has a basic structure known to all programmers. The first parameter passed becomes the first variable. The second becomes the second variable. The order that you pass the variables in the calling code determines which values get passed to the parameters in the method definition. So let's take a look at our first example. There's my method. We're going to have 3 parameters. We're going to call them apple, and cherry. And we're just going to have a really simple method here, and we're just going to concatenate them backwards. So we're going to do cherry. If you're not familiar with this syntax, it simply is a string interpolation. So we're making a string, and here we're going to put the cherry value, then we're going to put the banana value, and finally we're going to put the apple value. So oops, I put this backwards. There we go. So no surprises here. If I do my method 3, 2, 1, notice that I'm passing in integers, although they will be converted to strings because of the way I've written my method. And I run the arguments test. Oh, actually, you know what? I need to put the output so we can see it. It says 1, 2, 3, and that's simply because these are backwards: cherry, banana, apple. If I did 1, 2, 3, well, let's do 4, 5, 6. We would get 6, 5, 4. Let's use strings, which make it a little bit easier. I don't know. Let's do person, animal, mineral. We get mineral, animal, person. Those are all concatenated together. So let's add some spaces to make that look a little nicer. Mineral, animal, person, because I did them backwards, as you can see. The person becomes the apple, the animal becomes the banana, and the mineral becomes the cherry, and then they're simply in reverse order. So that's the example 1. If apple is not passed in, let's get rid of this. If apple is not passed in, we'll rewrite that in a second, it's going to have a default value of nil. If banana is not passed in, then let's say it's going to have a default value of a string that is missing. And if cherry is not passed in, let's give it a default value of 0. In this case, I'm going to make this a little bit more interesting. I'm going to say that apple is apple. And remember that this will just simply convert, the string interpolation will mean that any values get converted to strings. Again, just for demonstration. Banana is banana. Cherry is cherry. Okay, let's see what this does. So my method, let's say I do 4, found 3. What's going to happen? Apple is 4, banana is found, and cherry is 3. No surprises because I passed all 3 variables in. All of them were used. None of these default values were used. Now let's pass 1 value to the first one, and then a value to the second one, and then let's pass nil to the third one. Let's see what happens. So here we have apple is 4, banana is found, just as before. Cherry is nothing, not 0, right? Because I passed nil, so then cherry became nil inside of the method invocation. What happens if I leave off the argument itself? X, Y, Z, and then we're going to leave that off. We're going to leave off that third argument because the equal sign makes it optional If it's not passed, it will use the default value there. So here, the apple is 4, banana is XYZ, cherry is 0 because we specified cherry 0 up here. So if I said cherry is 5, and I rerun this, you'll see cherry is 5. Switch that back to 0. We can do the same thing with the second arguments. I'm just going to comment these out. So let's say we just pass 4 to apple. Then, oh, it didn't like that. My method. Apple is 4 because that was the first parameter we passed. So we didn't pass a second or third parameter. So banana is the string missing because that's the default here. And cherry is 0 because that's the default here. And then finally, because all 3 of these are optional, we could just do my method and pass it no arguments. And what will happen then is the defaults will get used for all 3. So nil, apple is nil, and then that translates to empty string when it's string interpolated. Banana is the string missing, so banana is missing, and cherry is 0. So that's example 2, and that demonstrates that basic positional arguments can be made optional. Now, on this example, I did all of these arguments as optional. But let's do something a little different. I'm going to leave the method invocation here. Let's say that apple is not optional. We're going to not put an equal sign, and that means that it's going to be required. Banana is also not optional, and cherry, let's say, is optional, still optional. So here we get some interesting stuff. If I do that just as we did before, 3, apple is 4, banana is found, cherry is 3, no surprises there. Yep, so here we're going to simply say, remember we're going to actually pass nil, and just remember that nil will be passed, and so 0 won't be used. So banana is 4, apple is 4, banana is found, cherry is nil, it becomes an empty string. And then in the next example, we're just going to pass 2 arguments, apple and banana. And what do we think is going to happen? Well, apple and banana will get passed, and then cherry will become 0 because we didn't pass no third argument here. Cherry is 0. Okay, now let's try some illegal Ruby. It won't work. If we just pass 1 argument, what will happen? Well, actually, my editor right here, my IDE, tells me what's going to happen. It underlines this in with a little red squiggly, we call that. And if I hover over it, it says missing argument banana required 2 or more. So it required, because banana doesn't have the equal sign, it's required. So if we run this, it says wrong number of arguments given 1, expected 2. And the same thing happens if I give it no arguments. Right, it doesn't like that either. Wrong number of arguments given 0, expected 2 or 3. Okay, so that's example 3, and it demonstrates that you can have the default arguments, the ones that have default values, be optional at the end of your method. So the optional ones in positional arguments should come at the end. And we're going to explore that in the next example right now. Take these away. More commonly used parameters typically come first because you can skip parameters from right to left, but you cannot skip parameters from left to right. And I'm about to show you a demonstration of this. Thus, the lesser used parameters are typically the ones that come after the more used parameters when designing an API. So example 4 is counterintuitive and does not work, and it's going to look like this. Let me get rid of cherry. Let's say I were to mistakenly do something like this. Apple equals A, comma, banana. Now, this isn't actually going to make any sense. But if I do puts my method and I give it b, the string b for apple, and then I give it the number 3 for banana, this will work because it will say that the string b is going to become the variable apple, and the integer 3 is going to become the variable banana. So that works. Apple is b, banana is 3. But what if I wanted to use the default value of apple? For example, I wanted it to be A. Well, I could pass it in as A, but that defeats the purpose of it being default. Can I do that? Can I leave it empty? And it turns out you can't do that. That's illegal. Ruby, it doesn't even parse correctly. What if I put nil here? So apple is empty string. It doesn't even use the A default string A there. And of course, if I just do my method, that's also illegal Ruby. It's going to say wrong number of arguments, given 0, expected 1 to 2. So this is a counterintuitive design because I've tried to make the first argument be the optional argument with a default value, but the second argument has no default value and therefore is required. This does not make any sense and does not work because there's no way to use the default value of apple. REST arguments with a single splat. Using a REST argument is how you tell Ruby to take the rest of the parameters or the rest of the arguments that are passed. And I mean you pass 1 or 2 or 3, and then if you pass more than the number of arguments in the method definition, those are considered the rest of the arguments. It takes all of the rest of the arguments and it turns them into a single array. In the method definition, you specify one single variable, an array, and it will take up any arguments that are beyond the ones that are in the method definition and turn them into an array. So you do this with a splat operator, and first I'm just going to show REST arguments with no positional arguments. And let's say I do money array, splat money array. See the little star, splat money array? Remember that a single argument, always the last, in your method will group up always all of the remaining arguments that you pass. So let's call them unclaimed by the positions. So if I had, for example, A, B, C, if I call this with 6 arguments, then it's going to take the number 1 goes to A, the number 2 goes to B, the number 3 goes to C, and then 4, 5, and 6 become the money array. But first, before we get to that, I'm just going to show it to you as with one splat argument, and we'll do it like this. So remember, money array is going to be an array, so I called it array. So I'm going to do money array join, which will just take the array and join it with spaces. Or we can join it with commas, that's fine too. So what do we think is going to happen here? 4, 6, 8. It took 4, 6, and 8. It said there were no specific positional arguments, there's just a single rest argument here. And it puts them into an array of 4, 6, and 8. An array that contains the values 4, 6, and 8. If I just put 2, it will just say 4 and 6, as you can see there. And what if I give it nothing? No arguments. Well, it says nothing. I can demonstrate that to you by commenting these out. And as you can see, it says there's no output. Because that, in that case, money array is simply an empty array. So I showed this to you just a little bit a second ago, just gave you a preview of it, but I'm going to show you what a rest arguments look like along with positional arguments. Let's say we have a method, we're going to call this blend, grain, and sugar. Remember, these are just totally arbitrary names. They don't really make a lot of sense in this case. Remember, the sugar is the rest argument, so it's going to take up the rest of the arguments beyond the first two and put it into an array called sugar. The first argument's going to be blend, and the second argument's going to be grain. So let's see, the sugar was sugar join, give it an and there, using blend at grain. So let's say amber for the blend, raw for the grain, and let's say we did just some numbers for the rest arguments. Let's say we did 56, 13, 4. Let's see what we get. The sugar was 56, 13, and 4 because those three became the array called sugar. Using amber, which is the blend, at raw, which is the grain. So just keep in mind that here we have two positional arguments that come in positions 1 and 2, and we have a rest argument at the very end. If I just give it one third argument, it's going to say the sugar was 56 and it's only an array with one value, so it doesn't concatenate anything, using amber at raw. Again, arbitrary examples. What if I gave it one argument? Well, just like we saw before, this is not allowed because it requires 2 or more arguments because the first 2 are required. So the wrong number of arguments given 1, expected 2 plus. And remember, see how it says it's expected 2 plus, because it knows there's a rest argument here that it can take more. So that was example 6. Oh yes, and while we're on it, just keep in mind that a Ruby method can only have one rest argument. So you can only do this one time, and it always has to come last. So what if I put salt here? This doesn't make any sense. Only one rest argument allowed. If I run it, actually it says syntax error because it doesn't even compile correctly, but my editor over here says only one rest argument allowed. It doesn't let you use 2 splats. That's not allowed. Go back to making it work. Okay, so the next example is a common pitfall, and it's a counterintuitive example, but it's something that I see somewhat commonly. Let's take out grain here. Now, you know what? The sugar, well, let's just do this a little bit simpler. Let's just do and we'll do sugar.inspect, which is just a debugger method to help us look at it. So let's say we did something a little counterintuitive, and I see this commonly among a lot of people new to Ruby. Let's say we passed a hash into the rest arguments. This is not a good example. This is a bad example. Lark2, leper5, 5. So the first argument, amber, becomes blend. We know what that does. Now I've taken the second argument and I've passed a hash into the rest arguments. This is sort of almost like a bastardization, because someone who writes code like this is actually, they kind of probably have some idea of what the REST arguments are doing, but they really don't actually fully understand that this argument, this REST argument, is going to group up the arguments into an array. Keep that in mind, because what I've done is I've passed a hash into an array. And here now we simply have an array, see those square braces on the outside, of a hash. It doesn't make any sense. The person who wrote this was attempting to use REST arguments. Maybe they were even thinking they were going to use keyword-based REST arguments, which are coming soon in the next examples. But they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't actually understand that this doesn't make any sense, because this now is an array. So to use this, you'd have to do sugar 0 item, and then you'd have to index it, for example, like lark. That might work. Yeah, so there I've said the 0 index, or the first item of the array, and then go to get the keyword. From the hash, we're going to get the key lark, and then return it. So this is kind of probably what they were trying to do, but then you see these weird constructions where it says sugar 0, or you see it says the array, the 0 index of the array. So this doesn't make any sense. This is not recommended. What you probably wanted to do when you were doing this was you probably wanted keyword arguments, which we're at right now, and we're going to explain what keyword arguments are next. Ruby keyword arguments were introduced in Ruby 2.0. And they give Ruby the ability for a parameter to be named. You specify its name in both the method definition and also in the calling code. You do this using a simple key value syntax. Now, when you use keyword arguments, you are freed from having to keep track of the strict positioning or arity of your methods, and are at liberty to be able to refactor your functions and your methods with less complexity to keep in your head. That's because when you use positional arguments, you have to remember the first position, the second position, the third position. It gets very tedious. I'm going to take a small detour to talk about conessence. What is conessence? Conessence between two software components, A and B, means either one, that you can postulate some change to A that would require B to be changed, or at least carefully checked, in order to preserve overall correctness, or two, that you can postulate some change that would require both A and B to be changed together in order to preserve overall correctness. When one Ruby method has to know the order of another Ruby method's positional arguments, we end up with a conessence of position. That means we'll need to change all of the callers or invocations of that method accordingly if we ever change the method arguments. That's an expensive cost of change. In addition, our mental model of how to use this method must change as well. Keyword arguments have trade-offs. Positional arguments offer a more succinct way to call a method, especially if that method only takes 1 or 2 arguments. However, the code clarity and maintainability gained from keyword arguments generally outweigh the brevity offered by positional arguments. If you can easily guess their meanings based on the method's name, and there are only 1 or 2 arguments, then positional arguments are still fine and perfectly acceptable. But generally speaking, code bases written after Ruby 2.0 should prefer keyword arguments, and you will see many that do. So, example 8, with 1 keyword argument. The difference between keyword arguments and positional arguments is that you will always notice a keyword argument if you see a colon. So here we're going to do apple, colon, nil. And now apple is explicitly named in the method definition. We're going to have to explicitly name it when we call it too. Colon. pass it something. We'll get to that in a second. So let's implement this. The apple is apple. And we'll give it, the apple is string Macintosh. So let's see what happens. Oops, I spelled my method incorrectly. Sorry for my quick typing there. The apple is Macintosh. So you see we specified the name of the argument in the invocation code down here, and we specified the name of the argument in the method definition. So example 9, 2 keyword arguments. Keyword arguments are reversible. They can come in any order, making them more powerful for refactoring your code in the future. Although it may feel like more typing, more verbose, the payoff for you in the long run is exponential because it removes the coupling to order-based or arity-based positional arguments. So let's do, in this example, we'll give it an apple, a nil, banana, nil. And this is saying that if nothing is passed for banana, it's going to use nil as the default. So here we have apple, Macintosh, banana, yellow. Oops, I didn't change this up here. There we go. Apple is Macintosh, banana is yellow. So let's see. And let's do another example. They're reversible. That was our example here. So banana can come first. Like I said, these are arbitrary examples. Fiji. So here, notice that we put banana first in the calling code and apple second, but in the method definition, we've put apple first and banana second. So they are reversible because they are explicitly named. And it works just the way you would expect. Apple is Fiji, banana is orange. And what happens if we leave one off? Well, let's say we leave... Okay, so then let's keep going. Example 10, we're going to add a thing to this. Oh yes, in example 10, we're going to mix positional arguments and keyword arguments. So first, I'm going to give it a thing, T-H-I-N-G. That's just the name of the variable I've chosen. And that's the first argument. So that's a positional argument. You'll notice it has no equal sign, so it's required. It has no colon, which makes it a positional argument. And then, just as before, we had apple and banana. So now my method doesn't work because it's missing the argument for thing. Let me give it rock. Now rock is going to become the thing variable. Let's add thing here. Okay. The apple is Macintosh, banana is yellow, but the thing is rock because we passed rock into thing. All right. And we can reverse the keyword arguments, right? So here we're going to put banana first. The apple is Fiji, the banana is orange, but the raw thing is a hard place. Right? Does that make sense? Now, let's say for our third example here, rock. We're just going to pass the first parameter, which is a positional argument for thing, and we're not going to pass apple or banana. Because they are optional, they'll get this nil value. I'm going to go over that in a second. But you'll notice the apple is empty string, the banana is empty string, because they were nil up here, and the nil got turned into empty string. But the thing is rock, because that's the only thing we passed. Let's try some illegal Ruby. This is not going to work. pass one positional argument first, then I put anything else as a second argument, and then I put the keyword arguments, apple, now this isn't going to work. In fact, my editor has told me right away, found extra argument, because I only have one positional argument, so I can only have one positional argument in my calling code. This is a second argument that is not positional in the definition, and it's also not a keyword argument, so it makes no sense. Ruby's not going to be happy with that. Wrong number of arguments, 2 given, expected 1. So that doesn't work. And just for demonstration purposes, what if I passed rock? Then let's say I passed cherry as a keyword argument. But there is no keyword argument cherry, right? I don't have cherry as a keyword argument defined in my method definition, but I do have it here in my invocation or my calling code. So it's going to tell me unknown keyword cherry, and that's also going to be illegal. Ruby, unknown keyword cherry, it's not going to work. Okay, let's go on. Example number, I think we're up to 10 now. 11, we're on example 11. Okay, so Ruby keyword arguments, I touched on this just lightly, but I didn't go into detail. Ruby keyword arguments can have a default or be required. Now this was actually introduced in Ruby 2.1. In Ruby 2.0, keyword arguments were always required. They could not have defaults. In Ruby, starting Ruby 2.1, they introduced keyword arguments with a default value, which makes them optional. So you can omit the keyword argument in the calling code, and that will use the default, just like you would expect. So here we're going to put apple as with a default of X, and we're going to put banana, and we're just going to put a colon with no value after the colon. That's important. Remember, when it has a value after the colon, that means that that keyword is optional. You can leave it off, and if you do leave it off, it will use the default value. When there's no value after the colon, like this, it looks a little funny. It looks like maybe something should be there, but what it's really saying is that that keyword argument is now not optional. It must be included. So here we do apple A, banana B. Let me do this here. Apple is apple. And what happens there? Apple is A, banana is B, just like we thought. Okay, example 12. This is an errant example, meaning illegal Ruby. You can only pass a keyword argument that is specified, unless you're using the rest arguments. We're at the double splat. We're going to get to that in a second. So let's say we do up here, we did this something like this before. Thing apple equals, let's say in this case we say apple is nil, banana is nil, and the apple is nil. The apple is apple, the banana is banana, but the thing is thing. So let's say we're going to have to go back to giving it this positional argument. Apple, and let's give it, I don't know, a keyword argument that doesn't exist. So let's say phone, iPhone, arbitrary examples. Now you'll notice I tried giving it a keyword argument that's in the calling code that doesn't exist in the method definition. So this is not going to work. Unknown keyword phone. You can't pass arbitrary keyword arguments unless you're using the keyword rest syntax, which we're going to get to in just a second. There is a way to make this work. And the way to make this work is called the double splat, or also known as keyword rest arguments. They work very similarly to positional rest arguments, but they're defined using a double splat. So here, we're going to do, I'm going to give you the example here, args hash. Splat, splat, args hash. Now this will work. Prior to Ruby 2.7, you could leave off the double splat, and you could just have something like that. Prior to Ruby 2.7. Prior to Ruby 2.7, Ruby would assume that the last argument would be turned into the hash for an unclaimed rest arguments. However, this behavior is deprecated, which means it's no longer used, and it was removed in Ruby 3.0. In Ruby 2.7, you'll get a warning message, and in Ruby 3.0, it's illegal. I'm currently in Ruby, I think, 3.2, so it's illegal. We can't do that. So in the following example, I'm using the badly named args hash, the variable name's args hash, to store a hash of the unspecified arguments, that is, any keywords which are not apple or banana. So in this case, phone. Let's say the thing is thing, the additional passed arguments are args. Remember, this is going to be a hash, not an array. Inspect. So what do you think is going to happen here? That apple is golden delicious, phone is iPhone, and we have not specified banana. And we can get away with not specifying banana because it has a default value nil up there. Apple is golden delicious, banana is empty string, but the thing is that, which was our first positional argument, right? The additional passed parameters are, and look, there's our hash, phone, what is the key, and iPhone is the value. So for example, if I wanted to check, let's say I wanted to check if args hash, let's say phone is present, we could do and then if we want to do something else, let's say if the args hash does not have phone in it, that is the rest keyword parameters does not have phone in it, phone is iPhone. But then let's say we do banana and I don't pass phone. Now it's going to say there are no additional args here. Let's say we did, I don't know, I'm going to use a character return here, phone, email, nobody at nowhere. Now, you'll notice phone and email are not keyword arguments, so they will all get grouped up into args hash, but since I checked for phone explicitly here, we're going to use that. Right? If I take away the if statement and I only have this code that I had before, it's going to say apple is golden delicious, banana is iPhone, but the thing is that the additional passed arguments are phone, a hash of phone and email. Notice that in this last example above, the calling code comes in a different order from the one before it. So phone, apple, and email, in both examples, oh yeah, sorry. Okay, so let me give you one more example here. It's going to be just like this one. Phone, apple, email and what does that do? The apple is golden delicious, the banana is empty string, but the thing is that the additional passed arguments are phone and email. So notice that in this last example above, the calling code comes in a different order than the one before it. Phone, apple, email, instead of apple and then the rest arguments afterwards. Nothing is required. Apple and banana are specified keywords that have defaults. In both examples, we called the method with keyword arguments phone and email, but that neither were defined as keyword arguments on the method definition. Apple came in a different order. That is, we put phone first and we put apple second. That didn't change the output. In both cases, apple was picked up as a properly named keyword argument, but the first and became a first-class variable within the method. And phone and email, which are not properly named keywords, didn't become variables in the method. Instead, they got put into the args hash, which is here. So unlike REST positional arguments, it isn't just about the position, it's about whether they're named or not. In these examples, email, which came at the end here, and phone, which came as the first keyword argument, neither one were named, but it still worked, right? Because it saw phone is not named, and so it put it into args hash. Apple is named, and so it put it into apple. And email is not named, and it put it into args hash. That's simply to show you that you can change the order of them as you go. So example 14, and this is our last example, and it's two examples of things you can't do, and that is you can't specify more than one double splat. So let's say I did hello, and let's say I try to do another double splat, goodbye. Well, this is illegal Ruby. It doesn't make any sense. You can only have one double splat in your method. Expected, it doesn't even make, I don't even know if that'll compile. Syntax error, it says syntax error, so that doesn't work. And the other thing that doesn't work here, this is again illegal Ruby, is if you try to specify anything after the rest keyword arguments or the double splat. So let's say I put in something else here, cherry, I don't know, give it 0. That doesn't work. You expect it doesn't parse correctly. You can't have the double splat in the middle here. You have to have it in this order. You have to have the positional arguments, then you have the keyword arguments, then you have the rest arguments, and you can only have one. Now there is an exception to that, and I'll see if this works. That, I didn't output anything. Oops. The thing is that apple is golden delicious, banana is empty string, cherry is 0, because I gave it a default here, and it didn't exist in the calling code, as you can see. And the rest arguments are phone and email. Let me try one more thing, which is what if we want rest positional arguments. I'm going to call these like that. And let's say we did And you know what? I'm gonna show this with you in ByBug. So we can really examine this. This is allowed, although it's very counterintuitive. It really doesn't make any sense. So here, thing, notice how we did this here. Thing is the first parameter, and that's that. So that's that. That's easy. So then we have 4 additional positional parameters, and we've specified rest args here. So rest args become with the single splat over here, become anything that is positional, but is not, but is additional to the number of positional arguments that we gave. So we only gave 1 positional argument, and we added 4 additional positional arguments, and that got grouped up into an array, just like we saw with the single splat rest arguments, and we put it into this array called rest args. That is allowed, although it's very counterintuitive, and this kind of writing Ruby like this would be very, very difficult to read. The rest of it does work. Apple is golden delicious, banana, cherry, 0, and then hello is going to be a hash of phone and email, which are the unclaimed keyword arguments. So in that case, we're using rest args and positional rest args and keyword rest args, although it's very confusing to do this, but it's just demonstrating to you that it can work. Keyword arguments, positional arguments, rest keyword arguments, rest positional arguments, splat and double splat in Ruby. Please do hit the like and follow if you're into this stuff. I would greatly appreciate it, and hope you've enjoyed the video.